like everybody. Is Emiliano. As I said in the newsletter, he forges his own blades, he makes his own Tamahagane, he does his own tempering, water tempering without clay, so it's going to be a very interesting meeting. So take it away, it's all yours.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. I've been forging, making swords, knives, all that sort of stuff as of this month for 10 years. So I started when I was in my first year of college, and I've always been interested in swords and knights, armor, samurai, you name it. But I never realized that it was something I could actually do until I got there to school and started forging stuff. So I started first pretty simple with making hooks and nails and those sorts of things, and then realized that a little bit of judicious use of the internet and a little bit of research could let me understand a lot of stuff that I would have to spend 30 years trying, to figure out on my own. So skipping forward a little bit, I started working on mostly historical stuff. I did a lot of Viking Age and medieval work, mostly swords, Viking axes, swords in the Viking style as well. But then I started trying to figure out how to do Japanese style work. And I realized that making it out of a bar of modern W2 is a good facsimile, but isn't quite, quite the real deal. So I decided I wanted to learn how to do it better. And to that end, I started learning about steel making, iron smelting, different ores, different ways of getting from iron to steel or from ore to steel. And so the method I eventually landed on is basically the same as is used in Japan, or was used in Japan. I go to the beach, in this case, Guilford Beach in Connecticut, and I use a magnet and gather as much iron sand as I can. And then we start building a small tatara, which in this case is made up of a bunch of sand, a little bit of water, some clay, and some peat moss. And we mix it all together in not quite even, usually 1 part sand to 1 part clay. This is kaolin clay, which is able to withstand a lot of temperature. And the peat moss kind of helps the material air a little bit while it's being fired. And then we basically dig a trench and fill it with charcoal dust, which is then kind of covered in a assortment of bricks. This is basically to build up the plinth for the furnace. There is my friend Matt getting ready to help me mix all the clay. And here we are building the furnace in the middle of January with frozen fingers. We started a fire inside of the furnace in an attempt to keep from freezing and to start curing the furnace so it wouldn't fall under its own weight. I basically wanted to make a large chamber on the inside, which is kind of like the birthing chamber for the bloom to come out of later, with a small diameter bore for the rest of the furnace stack, where it doesn't really need a lot of area. So the tuyere, the air blast, is coming in very near the bottom of the furnace, and the actual furnace itself is 45 inches tall, so it's about here. On one side, I made a little indent so that we knew where to charge the ore. All of this sand has been sifted and sorted. When you pick it off the beach, it's magnetite, which are these tiny little nodules of ore, which is Fe3O4. It's a form of iron oxide that can turn into iron and then subsequently steel pretty easily. So you want to put it in the same place. This is basically a chemical reaction, a chemical reduction, that's also a sintering process. So what that means is this ore, while it falls through this stack, there's that little channel, it basically is turning into iron as it goes. So when it's at the top of the furnace, this whole thing is lit up with charcoal and an air blast coming through. Your ore in the form of sand, if you were to just drop it in, the sand falls all the way through, it doesn't convert. So in order to mitigate that, I mix it with charcoal fines and water to make basically a mud pie out of ore and charcoal. The charcoal is fuel and the water burns off. And by the time it burns off, the material has started dropping in the furnace. So I basically, I time the furnace so that it drops a full charge of iron every maybe 9 to 10 minutes. So I'm making a layer cake basically. It's charcoal, ore, charcoal, ore, charcoal, ore, and that goes on for hours, maybe 6 hours. Usually it's between 4 and 7 hours depending on what you're making and how you want to do it. So we get the charcoal all the way up, the fire running as hot as it can go, and then I watch for the drop. I want, the furnace will settle to about here in about the 9 or 10 minutes, which is when I add more ore. And then it will drop again, more charcoal, more ore, more charcoal, more ore. And that process continues for the entire run of the furnace. But when it starts up here, it is just ore. It's an iron oxide, basically. What's happening is your charcoal is burning and releasing carbon monoxide. And that carbon monoxide is chemically stripping the oxide from the ferrous oxide, which is your ore. So what you end up with is like this kind of, like it's rust basically, and it's converting back into chemical iron. So that happens somewhere around here in the furnace. And as it continues to drop, it's in an atmosphere that is devoid of oxygen, which is what iron wants in order to intake carbon. So in order to make steel, I have to start with ore, which becomes iron, which becomes low carbon steel, which becomes high carbon steel, which can become cast iron if I'm not careful and not running the furnace properly. So I designed this furnace to make as high carbon material as I possibly could without being cast iron, which is not forgeable. This furnace runs for, I don't know, I think this one was 5 hours before a snowstorm came in, and you end up with something like this. This is a big lump of very high carbon steel that's made from black iron sand in a charcoal furnace. A lot of people are delicate about the terms used, about calling it Tamahagane. A lot of people are like, well, it's like champagne. You know, you can only call it that if it's made in these very specific, you know, if it doesn't come out of the Shimani furnace, it is a Tamahagane. But my kind of argument is that that furnace and that way of making steel is a pretty new thing. It isn't really the way that this material was made for most of Japanese history. Most Atara were, if I remember correctly, mostly square. But they were about the same size as what I was making. And they were making steel in village centers where they were gathering ore from the beach, from the streams, from a mountain that was nearby. So all of these ores that had different trace elements in them, different amounts of titanium, different amounts of manganese, all the other kind of stuff that's in this black iron sand, were changing the characteristics of the iron and steel that they were producing. So that's us after the snow started coming in and we had released the bloom. But the furnace itself, if it hadn't been built in cold conditions and hadn't fallen apart a little bit as we were extracting it, it would have been reused a couple times at least. These sparks are how you kind of measure the carbon that's inside the steel. This material is probably between like 1.2 to 1.8% carbon. When you start getting to 2, 2.5, 3% carbon, you have cast iron. The melting point of steel is basically inversely proportional to the amount of carbon it has. So if you have a ton of carbon, like a percentage point, you know, above what this stuff is, it'll melt at a really low temperature, which is why we use it to cast pans and other cookware, because it's readily, it's easy to melt it. But at this point, it's pretty high carbon. It's still forgeable, which is really good. The sparks, the kind of tails coming off the sparks and the amount of like kind of firework explosion that they have tells you a lot about the carbon that's inside, as well as the alloying elements. More low carbon iron will be a lot duller red. The sparks will be straighter. They won't have those big explosions. So a really good way to test kind of what the material you're getting out is like is by taking a piece of modern steel that has a carbon content that is fixed and testing it against this material just to see what you get. This was a really big chunk. Our yield was really, really good. It weighed almost 7 kilos, and we got a 35% yield. Turns out I redid the math. I didn't account for the sand, the quartz sand that was added in to help as a fluxing agent. So our yield was closer to 39%, which doesn't seem like a lot, and it isn't a lot. This process is very old and it is very inefficient. The way that we make steel nowadays is leagues better. Any modern knife is going to perform better than material that's made like this. Even if you've removed all the impurities, it just isn't a structure that is like string, the way that this stuff is. You're folding it into thousands and thousands and thousands of layers that are becoming smaller and smaller, and those just don't have the same strength as material that's being poured and forged out. So we charged 19.2 kilos of ore of black iron sand and got almost 7 out. This is kind of a rough table to show kind of how we keep track of it. It's basically just every 9 or 10 minutes we're putting a kilogram of iron, oxide in, as well as a kilo of charcoal. Near the end of the run, we usually double up and start charging it a little bit quicker, either at double the pace or at 1.5 times the pace. This was the day after, what was left of our little furnace. I imagine they were probably getting more than one use out of this stuff back then. But this is a small broken section of the bloom that came out. The grain is nice and big. It looks like it ought to. The stuff that we're used to seeing now, the stuff that's coming out of the Shimane furnace, is made in such large quantities and broken by an enormous drop hammer that's coming down that the colors, the size of the grains, everything that we're seeing is pretty much what I imagine as a kind of modern thing. I don't think you would have really been able to see much of that back then when making it in such small quantities. But it does look really beautiful. I mean, it's jeweled steel for a reason. Most of the forging I do is in propane. I don't have access to, like the fume hood and everything to get the stuff out of my shop if I were to set up a charcoal forge there. So it's all done in propane. I basically take the bloom, cut it in half, and then start folding it and forging it. The sparks that you see coming off, the little wispy ones coming up, are charcoal that's trapped inside the bloom. This stuff is being removed basically through the forging. I'll take this and draw it into a bar. That bar at the top there is half of the bloom that's down at the bottom. That material is basically going to get taken and folded 12 times in order to remove impurities, get rid of all the charcoal dust that's left, get rid of any other crap from the inside of the furnace that might have gotten mixed in there. There's often little bits of clay, other impurities from the ore that make their way into the material. So this is at about 5 folds. I've lost a lot of material already. So this puck of steel that I cut in half was 3.5 kilos. After all the folding, I had enough to make a tanto and some smaller blades. So this, I mean, you can imagine without a power hammer, with just strikers working in charcoal, the skill that was needed to do this back then is just mind-bending. I mean, it's really pretty amazing that you can take sand and actually turn it into something. I think my favorite thing about this process is at the beginning of the day, this stuff is sand that will run through your fingers, and at the end, it's a chunk of material that can actually be used to make a tool out of. Whether it's for farming or for warfare, it all has to start in the same place. This is a cut and etched section of this material after 5 folds. You can see the stringy inclusions that are left in the material still. The darker sections are also differences in carbon coming out in the etch. So this material I cut and restacked into a bunch of pieces, forged out again into a bar. The bar is starting to have square corners, which is a very good sign. When I make Roshigane instead of Tamahagane, the sign of quality for me is when I forge it out. If it has square corners before I even have to fold it once, I know that I'm good to go and that it's going to work with me for the rest of the process. So you can see some of the striations here from the different layers as I'm folding. I generally do 4 or 5 folds in the same direction to start getting rid of the pockets, the inclusions, the other crap that's stuck inside still, and then I'll start to switch directions in my folding. I generally tend to forge the billet to maybe 16 inches, fold it, cut it in half. So I've got, you know, an 8-inch piece of metal that's being forged out. I'll forge that out slightly to maybe 12 inches, cut that in half, 6 inches, forge that out. And once I have a block that's big and thick enough, I'll then flip the direction that I'm drawing it out in and then change the orientation of the folding. I'm sure all you guys are familiar with the different orientations. The way that people are folding is a very big contact point. It comes out in the hada. It shows you what somebody's actually doing to this material. Basically, after a little bit of forging, you end up with something that looks like a tanto, or a preform to one. And then you quench it in water. I cleaned it up with a grinder, kind of rough, just to get a clean surface so that I can go and affect the curvature of it. I didn't know to do this for a long time. Some of the pieces I brought with me have curvature in them, whereas I want the spine to be straight. So these pieces are curved downward first, very slightly. There's no rhyme or reason to it that's written out unless you're using clay, and everything is the same every time for a given thickness, a given length, and an amount of heat that you're putting in. But this piece basically gets quenched and turns into this red tanto that's over here with me here. All of this activity, the muneyake, the tobiyaki, everything is as a result of heating carefully in the fire and quenching in water. None of this has anything to do with clay. I don't use clay for almost any of my work. All of this is due to the heat zone that's in the blade, the amount of time I'm leaving it in the heat, the way that I'm moving it or not moving it in the water, and the angle at which it's put in the water. So all of these factors completely change what's going to happen when I harden this blade. As a result, I can get crazy choji, I can get suguha, I can make sakachoji, I can do pretty much whatever, but there's always an element of randomness, which is kind of what I like about it. So the next step on this piece was to try to figure out what I want it to look like. This is a piece that I really love the look of, the style of tanto without, with just a nice piece of stingray skin for the tsuka. I really loved that. So I decided to try something in that vein. So I started with an old tsuka from a tanto that's long gone, and a habaki that was close-ish to the size I wanted, and basically decided, okay, well, let's start here. And so I started taking different materials and trying to figure out what I wanted. This is a cow horn, translucent kind of golden horn. It looks kind of plasticky, which is the one thing I don't like about it in retrospect. But you can see the striations in it, so if you look close, you can tell what it is. I took a piece of fine silver, I started forging it. This is just hacked off the bar and rough forged before shaping the wings and kind of getting the proportions better shaped. This is the habaki roughly formed, just kind of filed off. and then soldered and roughly ground in order to get it ready for the rest of the work that was to come. The seam is pretty good, nice and thin. Getting the tapers for that sort of thing can be really tricky. The photos are all just from my workshop as I was putting this together. I took my wood. I was using basswood, I think, for this. Traced out my makoto and started using my sayonomi to get the fit. So this is partway through carving, trying to get it closely matched up. I got the habaki kind of cleaned up, put it in the pitch, started doing the chisel work to make the yujo finish. And then this is how it came out, all polished up. I also decided to make something a little more adventurous while I was at it, and took a leftover piece of the silver and tried to figure out the different types of marks, different spacing of them, trying to figure out how to push them back down to create the correct look of the different habaki that have this sort of file work all over them. So back to the tsuka. Here I have the tenon at the top started for the piece of cow horn. I have the mukugiyamas like placed, but not opened up yet. And I have the basic shape of this thing kind of figured out. The cow horn is left oversized once it's fit in there, and I go and choose a piece of stingray skin that I like for the project and get it placed. This is a piece from an old katana project that wasn't quite right. I decided not to use that one. And so here it is. I cut it oversized in every dimension, soak it in water for maybe 10 minutes, and then wrap it all the way around and cover it in hemp cord to keep it tied down. And then I go and start to clean up the rest of it. Here you can kind of see the mortise and tenon. There's the rough seam on the back, which I'll go and clean up later with the grinder. This is starting to clean it up. I've taken the front of it first, because I have a fuchi. I know exactly where this piece of same has to sit. So I can remove material until it sits square in the right spot. And this is kind of roughly what it's starting to look like. I place the hole in the same. Again, it's not opened up, it's just there to give me an idea of where it'll be.
Can you zoom this picture?
Yes, yeah. And this is from the back, in the process of trimming. I basically wanted to have something with a very slight hourglass to it. This tsuka isn't as dainty or thin as a lot of the ones that I've seen since then. This is the fitting, starting to be shaped and polished, starting to see how translucent the material gets. And then buffed up, it really has this beautiful kind of honey colored translucence to it, which is quite nice. And then I wanted to make the, there's a million different words for this piece that goes on the saya. But basically it's a retention piece. It's meant so that it doesn't come out of your obi as you dry your blade. The first version of this that I made was made from looking at photos because I didn't have a real one to look at. This is an issue that happens a lot when people are doing any sort of historical work, whether it's Japanese, whether it's European, medieval, whatever it is. Seeing stuff in photos is really good. Seeing it in person makes all the difference. Because when I look at something like this, I'm like, oh yeah, this seems fine. But when I look at the other proportion, it looks terrible. This wasn't at all what I wanted to go for. So I had it all polished up. I was working on the other pieces. The fittings were coming together. I put the kashira on there. I started opening the hole for the buffalo horn makugi, and it was starting to look really good. Started, being happy with it. But that other piece still wasn't quite right. So I went to a friend's place, and he had a really nice saya that had one of these on there, which is really helpful because if you have something that's in 3D and physical to look at, you can try to make a version of it or a copy of it that actually works. So basically, I wanted to make I don't know, some measurements of it. So I just took whatever I had with me and took photos with that piece next to it so that I could get a better feel for what it is that I was looking at. In this case, I basically had my keys. So I took a key and put it close as a ruler, and I went back and I reshaped and refit this piece. It's closer. If I were to make it again, I would make it differently, but that's the whole point of projects like this. It's a good learning experience. The Manuki and the Kozuka are two things that were like antique originals that I decided to use on this project. I haven't learned how to do uchidashi yet. It's on the list of things, but I started working on the saya. I figured the rest of the project was far enough along that I should start working on the rest of it. So here it is being glued with the overall shape figured out. I wanted to have a very, very subtle curve to it. And so I started marking out the mortise and tenon here after the rough shaping of the saya with hand planes. And then I took a piece of that horn and basically held the saya upside down, traced the mortise, the tenon, and created the mortise for it out of that horn. And I wanted to use this kozuka that I had, so I started figuring out how to carve this thing. I had a couple of antique saya that have this pocket in them, so I was able to figure out the angles, how deep it needed to go, and how much I could do without poking through into the channel of the saya, which is definitely scary because I really don't want to have to redo that part. And so this is basically me testing the fit up of all this stuff at home. This is kind of how it started. I marked out the wood. There's a horn piece that is a retention that goes up here. In order to make that fit, there are two channels you have to cut. One is the one that's visible right now, and another is a small channel for a tiny rectangle of horn to sit so that the blade can slide in and out of the side without scratching or digging into the wood. You can see here the angle that it has to be carved at in order to fit properly. I also decided that now is a good time to take the horn fitting and give it a little bit of shaping. There's a kind of scoop that's on the saya side, and on the fuchi side, there's a rounded scoop that needs to be carved and filed as well. So once the channel is cut and the kogatana fit all right, I glued it all back up and let it sit for a day or two, and then I started filing it back to create the cover for this piece. Here you can also see the little rectangular channel that's cut to accept that piece of horn. I basically marked out where that scoop was going to have to be, and started fitting the pieces of horn. There's that tiny rectangle, which is surprisingly difficult to carve, but here you can see the recess kind of roughed in for the kogatana to be able to sit at the correct angle. And what I found out once all this was said and done, if you do it right, when it closes, it makes this really satisfying click, which is a pretty nice detail. So at this point, I basically had it fully shaped. I was ready to prime the wood and start getting some sort of lacquer on this. I still needed to cut the, this was a photo that I found, I think on the Rihanto message board. Somebody posted a bunch of different styles of lacquer. I was looking at these and trying to figure out what I wanted to see on this piece. I was working on a katana for a client at the same time as I made this, and I figured if I was going to make a saya that's 30 inches long or whatever it was, I would much rather do a small piece first as a test, because doing something that's 12 inches is a hell of a lot easier. So I did some looking, tried to figure out what I wanted to see, and I landed on doing some sort of like gold-ish sort of lacquer. I'm doing all of this with automotive paints basically, because I don't have a setup to be able to control the moisture, the correct way to use urushi. I also just don't have the time. If I am going to be the craftsman that makes everything, then I can't afford to wait however long it's going to take for me to put on layer after layer of urushi and polish it all back. So I'm basically kind of cutting corners where it makes sense for me to do that as a modern craftsperson. So I primed the saya first, and then I started trying to figure out what sort of coloration I actually wanted. I decided to do both of these in black and gold. So black with some gold speckles on the piece, and a little bit of texture where the kozuka is going to fit. I wanted to have color down there that was thicker, and black on the rest of it that would then have some more light speckling. So I started trying to do all of this. What I ended up finding out is that this stuff is very, very particular, and if it doesn't have enough time to cure in between, yes?
Is that piece here that we can see?
Yes, yeah, I have it over here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Actually, do you want to just pass it around while I'm doing my thing? Thank you. If you're working on something like this and you don't have enough time in between layers, when you're doing the final polish after 3 weeks of doing this, you end up with this really wonderful effect on your material, which is this. The layers underneath are still too liquid, and so as you're handling it and moving it and polishing it and working on it, the outside layers start to move because the inside layer is still liquid, and you ruin 3 weeks of work and have to start over again. So I took this and I scraped it all off, got rid of all the primer, primed it again, and decided I wanted to do something different. The pictures that I just went by quickly were this. I did a test on a little file handle because I was really curious about the sort of wrinkle paint that's used on engines and engine blocks. And I wanted to do something like that. So I sprayed it, it creates this black sort of crinkle, and then I sprayed red lacquer over top, gently sanded the surface, and then sprayed clear lacquer over that, and it gave me this finish, which I was really, really happy with. So I wanted to do that instead. Once the black and gold didn't work, I said, screw it, let me try something better, I thought. So I decided to scrape all of this stuff off and start over. I took the kogatana that's in there and just used it to scrape all the bad paint off. And you can actually see here the gummy looking stuff that's underneath the surface was because the room wasn't heated enough. I didn't give it enough time. It's basically the issue with doing any of this sort of work in the winter. You have to have an environment that's suitable for it.
Each time you put another layer, basically dissolve the first one. So when you continue doing this, you're introducing more and more of dissolving things. So the curing is very important.
And the issue is mostly that in order for the paint to adhere to itself, it seems like the binder that's in it is supposed to very slightly re-wet the surface underneath it. And not taking that into account, I figured, oh, this is fine. It didn't off-gas enough because it was too cold and it wasn't able to cure as quickly as I needed. So in order to try to get this done, I just ran into trouble. But scrape it all off, start over. This time I used that crinkle paint. You can start to see the texture a little bit here. It develops over time, and it helps if you have a heat gun or an engine block, which is what it's meant for, that's able to heat it and cure it. So I did that and then sprayed the red lacquer over it, and then used very fine sandpaper to bring the surface down so that I could see the crinkles through it. And then used the clear lacquer over top in order to give it the right sort of finish. After that, it was time to make the rest of the horn fittings. I had roughed out most of the pieces, but I didn't bring them to the final thickness because I figured the lacquer would add a certain amount of thickness that I wouldn't be able to get rid of otherwise. Yeah, after a little bit of, well, a lot of toil, this was basically finished. Yeah, I'm happy with being able to mix traditional and modern techniques and materials and be able to get something that looks correct, or at least as close as I can make it right now. It's one of the things I really love about historical work like this. When I do Viking Age or European things, all those pieces that are sitting in museums are rusted and pitted, and you can't really even tell what it looked like originally. I was in the Philadelphia Museum of Art years ago looking at pieces, and a woman and her husband walked by, and she asked him if they were made of stone, because they looked so unrecognizable to the polished, beautiful steel that you expect pieces like this to be made from. So the thing I really love about the Japanese work is that when you look at a blade that's in good polish, you can see everything. You can see the individual martensitic crystals that make up the hard steel. Like, you can see the transitional zone, you can see the layers of the steel, the way it was forged, the intention that somebody put into it as they were making it. I mean, it's all on display for you to see in a way that it just isn't with European work, which I think is one of the things that drew me so much to the Japanese work, because when I'm making something, I can look at what I'm making objectively, or as close as I can get, and look at antiques and see what I'm doing okay, what I need to fix, what I need to change, what stuff I want to focus on more as I continue working. So this is basically the end of the stuff on on that project. I put a couple of videos in here so you can see. A wet mop works surprisingly well in order to keep that from hitting you in the face. All of that molten scale is 24-ish, 100 degrees. The forge is running pretty hot in order to weld this material. So I have my techo. This is just left in the water bucket to cool as I'm working. And I basically go and, if things go well, I'll do, after the initial folding, after the first stages, once this material is behaving, I will basically take this, forge it out as long as I can, hot cut it, fold it, and put it back in the forge, and the next heat I bring it out and I do the same thing. So the first couple folds are me working with material that does not want to be what I want it to be. This material wants to be crumbled on the ground. So my job as a smith is to try to kind of gently coax it into being the right shape and the right material. And so the power hammer helps a lot with that. Being able to forge it quickly helps a lot too. One of the issues in working in propane is that your carbon level drops fairly quickly compared to the way that it does when you're working in the charcoal. So in order to end up with material that is still at like 0.7, 0.8% carbon, like I want for a good tool that takes a good Hamon and is able to polish out well, I basically want to have a carbon content at the end that's good. So I shoot for very high carbon, and by the time I've folded this stuff 12 times, I end up with something that is actually around the right amount of carbon. As far as hardening without clay goes, I usually do that in propane as well. In this case, I'm doing a demonstration for a class that I taught in Tennessee that had nothing to do with Tamahagane or Roshigane or anything. But one of the guys there had seen a video I did on making steel, and he wanted to make a kitchen knife. His material was all destroyed, so I took it and I finished folding it for him to get rid of the pockets and the air bubbles. And I had them fill, some cold water, which was really nice because it was I think that whole week it was above 100 or close to it. So I did a hardening demo for them. This blade was made of Roshigane that he made from mild steel. So he remelted it in a small furnace to add carbon, and then folded it over and over again, and then gave up. And then I took over, folded it a couple more times. I heated it carefully in the forge. It's hard to see in video what the heat zone is like, but for a blade that ends up like this, where I have kind of a tall hitatsura, but with a defined line, a defined habuchi. I want something where the heat zone is just less than 50% of the way up the blade. In order to get something like this, it's all about the time that it's at temperature. It's the way that I'm heating it up, whether I'm doing it spine first or edge up, or I'm sorry, the other way around. And what I'm doing in the water. Like you guys saw, when it went into that cold water, it just stayed. The fact that it stays and I'm not moving it allows these kinds of bubbles to come up and create this dense activity in the steel that you don't really get to see otherwise. So in order to see something like this, where it's wild, but there's a bit of control to it, you have to, experiment quite a lot. But you can see there's a nice choji, it has a nice turn back. There's a little bit of muneyaki in there. This blade is metallurgically, I think, quite interesting. The nie are very big. You can see all of those activities close up. This is a quench of a different kitchen knife. Same sort of thing. What I'll do is I'll move back through here so you guys can see. That heat zone there is what I'm talking about. There's a differential in heat between the spine and the edge of the blade. Not only that, but I'm curving the edge down ever so slightly, because in water, just like you've seen with videos of katana, it wants to take curvature. So in order to control the curvature of the spine and of the edge, which for culinary knives is really important, I want to have a downward curve so that when it comes up, I get exactly the amount of curvature that I need. So, same thing, it's kind of hard to see in video accurately, but the heat zone is going to give me a turn back as well as a fairly controlled hamon on the spine there, or I'm sorry, on the edge. And it doesn't always go well. This is the first of 3 blades that I made for a trade with someone who wanted a kitchen knife made of this material. There's a tsuri in there. This is the second piece, also a failure. Really, really nice hamon, but 3 nice fatal cracks along with a bubble, which doesn't usually happen, but can. And then the third and final version of this blade was this. It's a little nicer. This one had a tsuri all over it as well. But what I was mostly interested in is the crystals. It might be kind of hard to see depending on where you are, but the nie, especially on the habuchi, are enormous. They're very defined. They polished out really, really beautifully. This is metallurgically at that point one of the nicest blades I had made. The hata is quite nice. The hamon is good. There's these kind of dripping tobiaki that I quite like, along with those big martensitic crystals. I think the other thing I love about this stuff is when steel is hardened, it goes between 2 states. It goes from the softened state and it has a phase shift into this hardened material. And the really wonderful thing about it is that it refracts light differently. Those nie are actually crystals that have been trapped in the middle of their transformation. And through polishing and revealing them, you can actually see what's happening on a molecular level to this material. This is another video of that same blade. You can see it a little more clearly there. A note on nie like this is pieces that you see that have nie all throughout the hata. Those are almost certainly pieces that were hardened using clay, getting the entire piece up to temperature more slowly and leaving it there so that the material underneath the clay is able to also get to a critical temperature. The difference in the thickness between the edge and the body is what creates the actual hamon, but you still get these nie that are forming on the body of the blade, which is a kind of cool metallurgical effect. And then this is a small tanto going in. Same thing, slight difference in temperature there, but you can see the downward curve as well. And when it comes out, if things go well, it'll come out with a perfectly straight mune. So Yeah, that's the main part of this that I put together. What's the time, Vitaly? Sorry.
45 minutes.
Oh, cool. Okay. Cool. So I have some other photos that I put together that are on a secondary steel making process for Oroshigane, which I can go through with you guys if you like as well. Is that okay?
I think so. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Quick question.
Yes.
How do you polish this? I mean, the blades and the knives that you said.
Yes.
How did you polish them with the stones? Or?
I don't use stones. I think it's pretty telling that to become a swordsmith, your apprenticeship is 5 or 6 years, and to become a polisher, it's easily double that. So I haven't gotten into the stone polishing for myself. I do everything with sandpaper, changing directions to make sure I get all the scratches out. Basically, same idea as before. I'm using non-traditional tools and techniques to try to make things as traditional as possible.
So,
and the outcome.
So you never tried even using a stone? Like
I've used mostly Uchigomori and finger stones to try to get surfaces that are right. But I think my issue has been mostly in not having the right assortment of finger stones to choose from. The hardness and softness is a big part, and any quality polish, as you look at it in the light, the Hamon actually is physically higher than the rest of the steel because it abrades less readily than the softer steel. So it's just hard. It's tough to get into that whole aspect of it as well as the making aspect. So I might do that at some point, but yeah. Yeah, I've done, but in modern material. I like Hirazukuri stuff for Tanto and Wakizashi, mostly because I like having a big flat area to see the hata and the hamon on. Shinogi-zukuri is certainly harder, but I've done katana and tanto in that in modern steels. So the first process I showed you guys, yeah, what's up?
Going back to the polishing
Yes.
with the stones, you're not supposed. A lot of people have done the sandpaper route to save the time.
Yeah.
But my question is that do you use any sort of acids to bring out the martensionite or anything like that, like a solution of your own? Or like
I use ferric chloride, which is technically a base, I think. But basically it sits in there for 5 to 10 seconds, just enough for me to be able to create a kind of more pronounced hamon that I then polish back.
So it's a base that you're using?
Yes, yeah. I think, I'd have to look at that again, but I'm pretty sure that's what ferric chloride is. It's very easy to neutralize. The blades that I have that have been sitting that are in polish, like that Tanto, it's not being eaten away. Yeah, that's the way I usually do it. So this secondary process is Oroshigane, which is taking nails, iron, any scrap, especially broken blades, and remelting it and reconstituting it. Oroshigane is a 3-step refinement. You are taking disparate pieces that are small and turning it into one big mass. You're controlling the amount of carbon that's inside of it, and you're controlling the amount of slag. Raw material, raw bloom often has a lot of slag if you're not careful, or if your ore isn't as clean as the magnetite sand that I use is. So you might actually need those 3 stages of refinement, getting rid of all the excess slag, making it into a big piece that you can actually work instead of stacking a bunch of tiny little pieces, which of course you can do, and getting the carbon where you want it. Using this process, you can raise or you can lower the carbon depending on what you want. And so I usually measure out a charge. This is all kind of little bits of steel, bits of iron, parts of failed projects, and they go into a small furnace. This is made of fire brick and mortar, basically. The air blast is doing almost the exact same thing as it's doing when I do a large satara. But the difference is I need a smaller amount of charcoal and a smaller amount of time to do this because the chemical reduction from iron ore to iron has already happened. Once it's actually iron, melting it and adding carbon is actually fairly easy. A friend of mine who I learned a lot of stuff from, including Clayless hardening, Pavel Wolf from the Czech Republic, his son, who was 8 at the time when I met him, was able to make better Oroshigane than his dad. There's like videos of him, you know, in a little bandana with these enormous tongs, making steel and like needing help picking out the huge blob of molten material to quench it in the water. So it's a pretty incredible process. And for me, it makes things a lot easier because whatever stuff is left over from the initial forging process that isn't able to be refined, you know, stuff that falls off, stuff that's on the ground, all of that can be run through the furnace again to create steel that is useful and able to be turned into, you know, a bladed object. So this is a piece of that Oroshigane. Some stuff to note in the way the material looks is there's sections that are very rounded. They look like frozen water, kind of. That's basically what's happening. This stuff is becoming nearly liquid and it's being frozen in place. So it's extremely high carbon.
Yeah, if you can maybe zoom it.
Yes, yeah, certainly. Yeah. So areas like what's there on the left, that big shiny spot, areas near where my finger is, all of those are places that are hardening to a really high degree. I used to take this stuff out of the furnace, take it straight to the power hammer and start folding it, but my steel was less clean. I was taking a lot of the slag and flux that's coming off of this stuff and folding it back in, which I don't want. So now what I do is I take the stuff out of the furnace and I quench it immediately. So I basically, you know, take it. It's now solidified from all those disparate tiny little pieces, and I take it and basically harden it in water. And it knocks all the slag, all the other stuff off of the material. You can see all this, the sparks that are still coming out are from the charcoal. So there's vapor and charcoal and all these other things that are being trapped and expelled. And after that, I have just a bunch of little pucks of material that I can then heat back up again and start consolidating. And the material is going to be much cleaner from the very beginning at that point. It's also pretty cool to be able to see fire coming out of the water when the thing's fully submerged. But this is the same thing I showed you guys before. The material is very, very high carbon. You can see those sparks. Sometimes they will come out, they explode, and then they explode again. It's a kind of not very scientific way of measuring kind of what material you're working with, but this gives me a really good idea of what I'm doing and what I'm looking for. If my material doesn't have enough carbon, I'm not going to bother finishing it. I'm just not, I would run it through the furnace again, or I would go ahead and use a different piece of material or something. For the amount of time it's going to take me to fold and refine, forge the blade, harden it, it's not worth the effort. So here's another nice piece of this material with those kind of round nodules. They're very silvery looking after quenching. So yeah, this process is used very, very commonly, especially in Japan. A lot of the smiths, the Yoshiharas for instance, were using 50% Oroshigane that they were making and 50% Tamahagane from the Shimane furnace for a very long time to make their pieces from. I think that that's a pretty common thing. In 2019, when we were waiting to you know, go into the Met for Marcus's you know, lecture and show and tell on the Shimosaka school, Kunio and I were sitting talking, and he asked me what I thought of the Shimane material. And I have a blade here that I made using that material, but it's very temperamental. The material doesn't polish the same way. It's much higher in carbon. The impurities are less, which might make a better product overall, but it takes away some of the look and the beauty of the material that you're expecting to see. So overall, I haven't liked that material quite as much. Those sparks that you see coming out are the steel melting, and you see the bubbling of the charcoal over top. This process, instead of 4 to 6 hours, takes 20 to 30 minutes from start to finish. And you can make very high carbon, very nice steel. That's, when it's folded, is almost completely indistinguishable. Unless you were to do a metallurgical analysis of this stuff, you would not know that it's a different material, which I think is pretty cool. More fancy big sparks. Same thing, more sparks. Big, you know, forge for folding all this stuff. I mark out the tallies as well as the as well as the number of layers when I'm folding this stuff. One of the reasons is I'll often do restack, where instead of just hot folding, I'll draw it out into a big bar, clean up the surfaces, cut it, and restack it, and then forge weld it again. The reason for that is I want to continue making sure that the material is clean on the inside as I fold. And if I find a bubble, I can cut into it, clean the inside of the material, flatten it again, and then forge weld it and get rid of that issue. Yeah.
So when you're making, I guess maybe long swords, are you doing a jacketed construction, or is it essentially a mono steel?
I've done jacketed construction before. Almost all the tanto I make are like mono steel,
right.
But with folded material. My issue has been mostly the material I make. I make a lot of very high carbon material. I don't really make a lot of lower carbon stuff.
Which is the softer stuff, right?
Exactly, yeah, like the core. I don't really make a lot of that softer material. So if I wanted to do kobuse or hansanmai or any of those more complex constructions, I would probably take a bar of this stuff, carburize it to a lower degree, fold it a similar amount of times, and then use that as the core with a high carbon jacket wrapped around it. I've done that before. The piece ended up having a flaw in the steel, so it was never finished. It's just a different way of approaching it. If I can make a large piece of nice steel and just forge a big blade from that feels like just as good to me. Metallurgically, unless somebody's going to go and actually fight with it, and it's going to meet other blades, the slight amount of shock resistance that it'll get is not that much better. Also, the blades that I've made that are from this mono steel construction, I had a piece that failed pretty majorly, that had a big bubble in it, and I got kind of upset, and I took it and bent it, and it bent to the point where the nakugo and the tip nearly touched before it cracked anywhere. So this material is really resilient. You can do a lot to it. All the pieces I make, I quench it in the water, and I take it out, and if it's bent, I'll straighten it cold. The material doesn't care. It's very, very forgiving. You just have to know the parameters, and sometimes break something in order to learn them.
So does that mean that on one of your tanto, for example, like the ha, where the Hamon is it at the same level of hardness technically as the rest of the blade?
No, it's not at the same level of hardness. The ha, in terms of Rockwell, I have chisels for testing Rockwell on my production stuff, like my regular work. This stuff is the same level of hardness. Out of the water, it's over 64 Rockwell, which is, for instance, a good kitchen knife will be between 59 and 61 generally. So it comes out screaming hard, and I have to temper it back by heating it up to a lower temperature in order to make the steel less brittle. Once it's tempered back, the stuff is both hard and pretty resilient, and can bend without taking a set to a certain degree.
So and that's where the heat difference between the picture you showed with the knife.
Yes.
That's where that comes in.
Yeah, exactly. That's in the control of the Hamon. Like where that hardened material is, it's very hard. Where the soft material is, it's buttery soft, which is kind of what you want for a resilient blade. It's what allows it to take that impact in without just being completely ruined. Same thing. Took that, folded it like 12 times. And then I had a big bar of Tamahagane that I wanted to do something with. So I took that. I have a tsunagi from Yoshindo from years and years and years ago that I make copies of to have in the shop with me. This is a kind of otanto wakizashi sort of thing that is kind of his standard wakizashi that I think is just absolutely lovely. So I've tried copying it a few times. I'm not quite there yet, but it's a piece that I want to keep working on. I forged 2 smaller knives quickly out of the same material, and I cleaned them all up, hardened them. You can start to see the Hamon a little bit on the large one. I basically made a fairly nicely burled mokame sort of pattern on all of them. Cleaned them up in further grinding, and then I started to plan out the rest of this. I softened the nakugo in the fire so that I can drill the Makugiana and do the yasurime. I had to harden this piece twice. The first time I didn't like the result, and in hardening it a second time the curvature increased. Initially the curvature was actually pretty much exactly the same as the tsunagi that I had, which I was really happy about, but The second time around it got more, which is fine. Like I said, this is a piece that I'll be trying to make over time, I think. And this was post etching. You can kind of see a little bit of what was going on in there. There's Utsuri, there's the main Hamon. There's a lot of activity in there. This piece is one that I will be repolishing, so I can actually see the activity in it again. That's kind of another view of it. The really nice thing about etching is even if you're not going to etch for a long time like you would with Damascus, you can see all of the activities that are inside the steel. So if you have Utsuri, if you have Mizukage, if you have any of those sorts of maybe Utsuri, whatever it is, you have all of these different effects that are available for you to see with your naked eye. And you have stuff like this. You can see the areas where there's really large crystals in the material itself. You can start to see the folding lines. Those darker areas up here are the Utsuri above the main Hamon line. You can see it much more clearly here in this photo. It follows the shape of the Hamon fairly well in most spots. The piece gets signed. My Mei and Kanji are getting better, but it is surprisingly hard to do. It's also one of those things where you can't really mess up and erase it, so it's kind of a one and done. I made a mistake on this one and have 2 chisel strokes down here at the very bottom character, so instead of saying something to the effect of a lucky day, it says a lucky year, which is fun. So yeah, same thing. This one was going to get a habaki that was a Niju habaki. So I started forging the first one out of copper. I forged another collar out of copper that I then fit. I soldered fine silver wings onto it, and then started filing and refining the shape of everything until I was happy with it. And then this piece was just going to be in Shirasaya, so I decided to, there you can see the little sideways solder joint on the little collar on the bottom. I basically took some pieces of hinoki and cut them at an angle so that I'd be able to make everything fit properly. Started chiseling, pretty similar to what I showed you guys the first time around. Tried to get the fit as close as possible. The Shirasai is okay. I've done certainly a lot better since then on the pieces that I make. Roughly carved. I went after this and scraped everything out with a kiradashi to really get it properly shaped. Because it's Hirazukuri, everything's pretty nice and flat anyway. But here's kind of what it looked like before fitting the habaki and getting everything trued up properly. A friend of mine made me a hand tool for getting the correct taper of the mukugi. So I go in and I widen the hole and get it to the exact taper that I want. Oh, there it is. So this is the piece kind of before the final polish. I made a hatome for this piece out of mammoth ivory. I didn't have any actual ivory, so I figured it would be better to use really old stuff that's definitely pre-banned. So using dopping wax, the same sort of stuff you'd use for jewelry work, I took a piece of this and I drilled and shaped and formed it on the lathe. And then, so I've got my 2 hatome on the left there, and I started drilling, and this is kind of how it came out. This piece is here as well. Like I said, it needs to be repolished. I can't really see the activity that I want to see in it. So it'll be a slightly different polishing regimen to the way I usually do it. We tried doing the kind of black background, light coming in from the side to reveal everything. Didn't really work so well. But that's basically it. That's the presentation I brought for you guys to kind of talk about a little bit of the work I do and what I'm doing here, as someone who's self-trained. So yeah, that's pretty much it. you guys have any questions?
I got one.
Yeah.
We talked about Oroshi and Tamahagane.
Yes.
Is there any correlation to what's used for Kawagane and Shingane, or they're both mixed for both?
To my understanding, they're both mixed for both. It's mostly about the level of carbon. The Shingane will often be pretty low carbon iron, and it will often be really low refinement also. So I'm sure you've seen an old blade where it's kind of tired, it's been polished a bunch of times, and when you look at it, you're like, oh wow, this thing's like, you could see the wire in it, you can see the grain of the iron, which you don't really see in the same way on nicely refined steel. So I think the core steel oftentimes was just like the lowest carbon, low refined stuff that they could find.
Do you think it's more likely Oroshi?
It is most likely Oroshi because they were using small bits of iron probably to refine them, but they were either basically just puddling it to get it into one piece, or taking it and folding it up in small pieces, the way that you see somebody build a stack of plates.
Right.
You could do that with small bits of iron that are broken up too. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You experimented with making different types of hada, and it seems like maybe hada.
Yes.
Have you found that one is more challenging to do well, or are they all equally difficult?
I think it's difficult because the final work that you do on any of them changes the whole look. When you're doing Ayasugi hada, like, you know, for any sort of Gasan school style work, the way that you're folding it has to be very precise. You want mostly masame to start off, and then you cut in or forge in your undulations in order to get the hada to come out correctly. But if you're folding it correctly, or if you're changing the direction too much, you'll end up with more mokume, and it doesn't quite look right. I really like mokume in general. I find that, especially in modern Damascus, the way that I forged it, you can actually see in the finished piece, and I think that's a really good benefit to making mokume, that the hammer blows are actually like visible in the final product. And so to that end, a lot of smiths will take a small ball peen or a smaller hammer, and they'll pattern the blade as they're working. So when they make their sonobe, they'll pattern it very gently, and then file or grind or remove some of the material, and then do that during different stages of forging to make this very burled, deep looking material. So you lose a little more material, but you end up with something that's much more active. And that can look really fantastic with the Suguha Hamon. So it depends on the school and what the person wants and all that sort of stuff. But generally for my own work, I like kind of like medium density mokume with a really wild choji Hamon. That's kind of like my favorite sort of thing to go for. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you guys.
Thank you.